button.
Yes.
And the floor is yours, Professor Everett.
I missed the last remark. What you said.
The last remark was the floor is yours.
Oh, okay, good. I thought that's what you might have said since everything went silent. So my talk, I've sent you an enormous amount of slides, but I won't bore you with all of them today, but they come out of my work. And so if you want to just have a sort of a PDF PowerPoint summary of things that I'm talking about and thinking about, those slides are available. I was driving home 3 days ago from visiting family down south, and I took time to stop during a snowstorm to visit Peirce's grave, since it was right along the way. And there's a new headstone monument for Peirce there. The small headstone in the front is where Peirce and his wife Juliet are buried. It's Juliet's body and Peirce's ashes, and this new monument was recently dedicated to Peirce there. Then I also took a picture in the snow of Arisby Peirce's house, which is now the headquarters of the Delaware water control project. So a bunch of water engineers working inside his house. But they've left the house more or less as Peirce had it, and they're very nice if you're around there to be willing to stop work and take you on a tour of Peirce's house, which still has some of his drawings and plans and documents and photos around the house. So it's a nice experience. I won't read this quote to you, but it's in the slides in case anyone feels ambitious and wants to know how they compare to Peirce in terms of polymath contributions to knowledge. So the outline of this talk roughly is to go through what is meant by inference. What are Peircean signs as opposed to, say, Saussurean signs? What are propositions and what is their relationship to sentences? What is inference in temporal interpretations and inference in larger units? And proposition, signs, inference, and the origin of human language. I may not get to all of this, but I will do my best. So this is a famous quote by Peirce: "The elements of every concept enter into logical thought at the gate of perception and make their exit at the gate of purposive action. And whatever cannot show its passport at these gates is to be arrested as unauthorized by reason." So the basic idea is we're surrounded and penetrated by data, and we make inferences about the data, and we come up with knowledge after testing our inferences. We know that a lot of the study of inference began with Socrates, with Aristotle. The first two types, deduction and induction, are types that Aristotle worked with extensively. So the basic three ductions, duction means to lead or take away from. So deduction starts with the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. Induction starts with the minor premise, or that is the conclusion, and Socrates is mortal. We can propose that Socrates is a man and then generalize to all men are mortal. And abduction is the formalization of guessing. There's a lot of talk these days stemming back to work by Gilbert Harman, the philosopher, on abduction as inference to the best explanation, but that sort of reverses Peirce's insight because it goes to the end of the process, whereas Peirce meant abduction to be the beginning of the process of acquiring new knowledge. It's guessing. So Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. That doesn't follow automatically as it does in deduction, but it's a good guess, and it's the only way that our knowledge is really amplified, according to Peirce. I'm going to argue that compositionality which is a way of the standard definition is it's a way of putting together signs, including the structures and words and phrases, all of which are signs, to induce meaning. It is the form of synthesis. Parsing and interpretation is a form of analysis, to take apart the results of compositionality, to deduce meaning. So one is induction, compositionality, one is deduction, parsing or interpretation. But a lot of the meanings we deal with are not either deduction or induction, they're anticipated meanings, and we supply missing bits of meaning by guessing. Abduction is based on experience, on culture, on psychology, statistics, knowledge of language. So we bring everything to bear that we've experienced in our lives when we are guessing at the meaning of something. As you all know, the biggest difference, one of the big differences, it's not the biggest difference, but one of the biggest differences between Peirce and Saussure. Actually, I was reading in the biography of Saussure, the excellent biography that came out a few years ago, that there is evidence that before he wrote his theory of signs, he had seen Peirce's work in manuscript form. And if that's the case, then Peirce gets even more credit. But whereas Saussure's view of signs was dual, Peirce's was tripartite. There's an object, a representamen or a form, and an interpretant. Every sign can be determined relative to one of its three components. With regard to the objects, the signs are icons, indexes, and symbols. Peirce scholars have settled more or less on a 10-sign system, though in 1903, Peirce proposed a 66-sign system that, as far as I can tell, never really seemed to have caught on. And it didn't seem to catch on with Peirce either. He didn't use it much. One of the things I want to emphasize is Peirce's concept of the Deci sign, which is proposition, but it's, as we might know, as you may know, for Peirce, a proposition doesn't require language. This is somewhat heretical for many philosophers and linguists. A proposition is basically a sentence, whereas for Peirce, a proposition or the Deci sign is found in many places, in pictures and weather vanes and sentences and lexical representations, in the structural templates of role and reference grammar and relevance theory operations and minimalist merge outputs. The first combination of symbols would have produced a Deci sign. That's not technically as Peirce would have put it, but if I'm able to come back to that, I will. Where the semantics are the core to the syntax being a way of expressing the semantics. In other words, syntax is not autonomous in this particular theory, in my interpretation of it. An icon is a sign that resembles or corresponds systematically to its referent. Very often in the literature, especially the typological literature, one sees references to the icon as strictly a resemblance, but an icon is much more than a resemblance. And in fact, as we're going to see, the predicate of every proposition is an icon. So a photograph, a painting, a diagram, blueprints, but also the verb phrase is an icon. The predicate is an icon. Index, a sign connected physically to its referent. Footprints, smoke, smells, pointing. The physical connection of pointing is largely imagined, so it's physically indicated. Symbol is a sign that picks out a referent by convention. Dog means canine because English speakers agree that it does. That's not all a symbol does, but we will return to it if it's necessary to give further discussion of symbols. So again, icons are non-arbitrary. They can be used in the absence of the object. This is very important when we look at the evolution of language and find the first recognition of icons and the collection of icons by Australopithecus africanus about 3 million years ago, which is a fairly interesting cognitive milestone. Spectrogram readings are icons, tree diagrams are icons, physical resemblance is an icon. Description of properties is an icon. Indexes, again, are physical connection to object, real or implied. And symbols are generalizations, conventional, cultural, implies icons and indexes. In a sense, for Peirce, every symbol has an index and an icon built into it. I'll only talk about that today. I started to say this morning, but of course it's not this morning for you when I talk about propositions. So let's say you've gone to a market. Everybody has the experience of traveling to a new place, not speaking the language, and needing to buy some food. So most of us have probably had the experience at the open air market. And we find that most of us can get by just fine buying a few vegetables and fruits or meat at the market by pointing and nodding and holding up fingers to indicate how many tomatoes we want. And the clerk, the owner of the little stall, seems to recognize what we're after. And we can conclude an entire transaction without language at the market. So how is it that we're able to communicate without language? And is this totally separate from language? Well, both are semiotic processes. We communicate. Language is a semiotic process. Peirce was at pains during his entire career to emphasize that language is not special in any sense that we ought to have a theory about language that excludes other types of signs. Peirce, in the 100,000 pages of manuscripts that are in the Houghton archive at Harvard University, and I've taken photos of about 50,000 of those and hope to work my way through the rest of them over the next couple of months. He wrote over 127 articles on linguistics. He was very interested in linguistics. He became one of the leading Egyptologists. I have several pages of his musings about the grammar of Tagalog and other. So he was very interested in grammar. He was very interested in linguistics, but he was interested in these as extensions of semiotics. What are the implications of being able to communicate without language? Well, one of the implications is that propositions do not require language. So here is a perfectly expressed proposition, a weather vane. There is an index, which is the direction of the pointer. There is an object, the wind, and there is a predicate. It tells us which way the wind is blowing. So this basically says, if we were to translate it into language, that the wind is pointing in a particular direction. We use these kinds of propositions all the time. Our lives would not be possible without them. In fact, many times we are speaking a sentence and leave off maybe the verb phrase and complete it with gesturing. Kenneth Pike, in his massive book that I don't know anybody who's read these days, A Unified Theory of the Structure of Human Behavior, and Pike seems to have been influenced by all the pragmatists and by Peirce as well, but it seems more indirect in the case of Peirce. Pike shows how we can take an entire story and gradually substitute everything in it for gestures to tell the whole story. And this is apart from sign language. This is just anybody able to improvise these things. So what is a proposition? Well, according to Peirce, a proposition is an index and an icon that produces a symbol. So John is a nice guy. Is a nice guy is a property. So it corresponds to something in the world. And in the sense that it corresponds, it's an icon. So every predicate is an icon because it corresponds to something in the world. But what is that thing that it corresponds to in the world? Well, it corresponds to John. So John is we know who John is. John Anchors is a nice guy in the world. In fact, this seems to be the function of syntax generally, is to provide inferential anchors for our reasoning processes. In this sense, a proposition not only doesn't have to be expressed linguistically, a linguistic proposition doesn't have to take a particular form. It's very interesting that as propositions were being studied intensely, especially during the rise of computer science in the 50s, one young linguist by the name of Noam Chomsky decided to make the proposition the start symbol for his entire theory of grammar, and this is not varied. I believe that's unfortunate. It was influenced by the zeitgeist of the time, but there's no particular reason that sentences should be the focus of grammar. In fact, to me, sentences are constituents of discourse, and discourse is constituent of conversation. So the focus of grammar should be, as Ken Pike would have had it, the conversation, and sentences fall out of conversations as one constituent of a larger whole. And conversations express series of propositions, and some of those propositions are linguistic, and some of those propositions are gestural, and some of those propositions are culturally inferred. And we have to, I wouldn't use language in the way that Edward Hall uses it, but I think we can get his gist by reading this quote. It wasn't just that people talk to each other without the use of words, but that there is an entire universe of behavior that is unexplored, unexamined, and very much taken for granted. It functions outside conscious awareness. What is most difficult to accept is the fact that our own cultural patterns are literally unique and therefore not universal. There's a great deal of interest among linguists to validate their work by finding universals that it is associated with. However, I tend to agree with William James that we need to be careful of generalizations. That's not to say we avoid generalizations or we avoid universals. In fact, Peirce was a realist, and a realist believes in universals of all things. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with universals in a Peircean theory of language, but we need to be very careful that we're paying attention to the particulars. We need individual grammars every bit as much as we need theories of grammar. And I'm of the opinion that the best theories of grammar come from people who write grammars of languages. So I tried to advance this in a book that I published in 2017 with University of Chicago on Dark Matter of the Mind, the Culturally Articulated Unconscious. So let's talk about inference from at a sort of general level. And I obviously take a sentence that is not supposed to have any meaning. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So the hibernating bear's dreams became colorless, mere black and white ideas of its green forest. Nevertheless, the unconscious bear's colorless green ideas slept furiously in its cuneiform brain, preparing it for the great awakening day in the spring. I think we can all get sense out of that. I don't think that is semantically ill-formed or syntactically ill-formed at all. But then I add Jack and Jill went up the hill. Now that really is jarring. What has that got to do with anything? When we hear sentences, when we hear expressions, when we see gestures, we're trying to bring coherence to everything around us. That's how we achieve understanding. But if I add to the last sentence and encounter the sleeping bear, well, now we've got the beginnings of a story, and we're very happy to see this because we don't like to be left with incoherent jumbles of sentences. We're always looking for coherence. In fact, if we didn't hear this last bit and encounter the sleeping bear, we'd probably supply it. And computers have actually gotten to be good at that. I am grading a large number of term papers for my students right now. And I have discovered, as you all are no doubt aware of, that with new artificial intelligence applications, students can just enter the topic of their essay and the computer will write the essay for them. So I realize I have to go away from essays or alter the way that I assign them. In any case, part of the way computers work, part of the ways artificial intelligence works is to look for coherence, predict coherence, to infer. So inference is definitely extremely important for computational work. I'll skip this. You can look at it if you like. What is a proposition? Again, there's different views. An assertion that expresses a judgment or an opinion. Some people take it to be the meaning of a declarative sentence, but as I think I've shown, these are too narrow. A proposition in the Peircean sense is a symbol composed of an index and an icon, and that doesn't have to be spoken. The perfect symbol, according to Peirce, he called it a perfect symbol, was an argument or a discourse, conversation of certain types. A deductive syllogism, for example, would be a perfect symbol. In this sense, I argue that we study discourses and conversations because they are closer to perfect symbols, and sentences are symbols that are constituents of the perfect symbol in that Peircean sense. Now, in Pitaha, there is a lack of lexical, morphological, syntactic precision of talking about time, what I could call underspecified temporal interpretations in Pitaha, or syntactically underspecified temporal interpretations. So you can, and also in a paper that I wrote with Mike Frank and Steve Piantadosi and Ted Gibson many years ago on numerical cognition in Pitaha, we talked about number words as cognitive technology. We've shown that the Pitaha intelligence compares well with any Westerners' intelligence on a number of tests we did there, reported on in other papers. And yet, without numbers, and they don't have any numbers, not even the number one, we show that it's very difficult to count and do correspondences, things that are not relevant for their culture, but numbers help with inference, with numerical inference, just as words help with semantic inference. So there's a reason we have language instead of just pointing. But I should also make the point, although I won't be talking about it in this talk today, is that animals have inference. Animals arguably have symbols. Animals use indexes and icons. I think animal cognition is focused primarily in indexes and icons, but they do occasionally come up with symbols. Those symbols are often phylogenetic. They seem to not be productive, but things like vervet alarm calls that seem to have evolved naturally. Whereas for humans, our symbols come from a productive system. We can create as many symbols as we want. Therefore, we can create inferential anchors, which I think symbols and indexes and icons are at will to help us. So time words in Pitaha, there's sotwa already. So I can say, I'm going now. I already go, chisoa kahape. Or I can say I already left. Chisoa kahapa. But I'm going now could, in some circumstances, also mean I already left. And so these meanings are not completely fixed. These are common meanings with B and C. So already, actually, Portuguese has a word very similar to it, já, and I'm sure many other languages do. So this is not an unusual word, but time is ambiguous. So ogio, which means big time, is long time ago or a long time from now. So the foreigner died a long time ago, awe so ogio koai, or he will have died a long time from now. There are a couple of other words like piaiso, when the water is thin, which is summer or dry season. So my name in Pitaha used to be Ogiai hit piaiso abopai maisihiai. So Dan will return in the summer. That's how you would say it, but literally it means water thin, return my sea. And there are a number of other examples of time words, such as Brazil nut season, which is chehekaubiso, when the Brazil nuts fall. Don't go out at night. Don't move into the biosphere when there's fire. He is staying several days, which is just a couple of days. They have sequential markers. So oppai, which literally means head, can be used for first. You go first. You can mean to go next, which is to go at the butt of the line. And there's the word gaba, which means then or next. So Kohoi was born first, then Poyoi. When I finish eating, actually the punctuations are a bit off here, but that's all right. And there are telic and completive aspects. So Pitaha has a few different types of aspect markers, although they don't have tense. Every Pitaha verb has 2 to the 16th power possible forms, just counting from the root back through the suffixes. It doesn't count the other roots that can be placed in templatic form before the main root, which would increase the number. But 2 to the 16th power is roughly 65,000 verb forms for every Pitaha verb, which is a lot more than English's 5 possible verb forms, or Portuguese's 40 or 50 possible verb forms. But among those 65,000 verb forms, no tense. There's no present, past, or future. In the literature on, in the popular reporting about Pitaha, it has often been claimed that they have no concept of past and no concept of future. This is just false. You do not need language to have a concept of the past or a concept of the future. We put too much weight on language for our ability to think. I do believe in I do believe the evidence supports some weak version of the Whorfian hypothesis. But on the other hand, there's no strong version that has been established. And I don't believe that language determines the way we think. In fact, I think the evidence is strongly to the contrary. So, I've never said that the Pitaha have no concept of the past. I've never said the Pitaha have no concept of the future. I just have said that they don't talk about the past much, and they don't talk about the future much. They limit their conversations almost exclusively to talking about the here and now. That's reflected partially in their verb form. They have temporal sentences, such as when you finish eating, I want to talk to you. We have translated it like that in English, but it just means eating. I have a frustrated initiation of wanting to talk to you. So I can't talk to you right now because you're eating, but that implies I would like to talk to you when you're done eating. The role of inference is crucial in this. But if I put the telic on there, you're finished eating. I want to talk to you, but I still use frustrated initiation, which gives you an opportunity to infer from that I want you to talk to me now. So this is not expressed directly in the syntax or the semantics, but it gives enough evidence for inference. So for example, if I want something that you have, I don't say I want that. I say I almost begin to want that. I want it with frustrated initiation. That gives you an opportunity to say, I'm not giving it away. And then I can say, well, I didn't say I wanted it. I said I almost wanted it. I almost began to want it. But you can infer from me saying that I almost began to want it that, in fact, I want it. But it's a face-saving mechanism. So inference is quite useful. All languages have ambiguity. This is not an accident. This is because language evolved for communication, and communication finds ambiguity and vagueness extremely important. After all, how could you be a politician if you didn't have vagueness and ambiguity? You have to have vagueness and ambiguity to have plausible deniability, which is a very important function of language. But inference lets us know. One of the interesting things about the court system, I think in every country in the world, is that you can use linguistic evidence, what the person actually said or literally said. You can show their words and the standard dictionary definition of the words, but you can't use inference in court arguments. You can't say he said this, but what he was inferring was this, even though, and I'm glad they can't, because there are many inferences one could propose, but even though inference is the main cognitive tool that we use to communicate, there's nothing more important. Signs, the semiotics are all anchors to help us infer, to get at the content of other minds. So there are conditionals in Pitaha, but just like the tense words, they're done by inference. So it's water is moving. There are no weather verbs, monovalent weather verbs in Pitaha. They're transitive. Water is moving, old information. So, we can see around that water is moving. I'm not giving you any new information here. I'm going. I'm not going. So that can also be interpreted as if it rains, I won't go. And both interpretations are processes of inference. Some people have thought that if a language doesn't have words for a particular set of concepts, that the people somehow could not think of those concepts, or that they're somehow intellectually inferior. But this is incorrect. Language is not necessary for many of these things. It's simply a functional device to help us make inferences. So I can get across past readings through inference. I see telic arrow, remote, it's out of my control. This can usually mean I was looking at the arrow and I'm not looking at it now. Did the meat run out? There's no past tense in this, but with the telic and the perfective and the interrogative, two forms of interrogative, interestingly enough, we can get across the question, did the meat run out, or I was eating meat. And the same thing with the future tense. He die, a telic, imperfective, remote. It's out of our control. So it's probably future because it's out of our control and it hasn't been completed. So he will die. And there are many other examples. Present tense works along these lines. In the theory of tense developed by Hans Reichenbach, there are three semantic nodes to hang tense on. There's the moment of speech, the time of reference, and the time of the event. And that gives us present tense when they're all together, past tense when the moment of speech is ahead of the event, future tense when the moment of speech is behind the event, present perfect when the moment of speech follows the event but is prior to the reference point, past perfect, future perfect. And I've claimed in other papers that Pitaha simply lacks the R point. There's no reference point because it's done by inference. It's not needed to have that. And that would explain the lack of the perfect tenses in Pitaha as formal markers. I'm just going to mention this briefly. There's something that Reichenbach spends a lot of time on, and I have a new article coming out in a Cambridge University Press volume, Understanding Human Time, that's edited by Kasia Jaskov, and on Pitaha tenses and inference. And what I want to say here is simply that there is no sequence of tense markers that link two sentences formally. And the reason for that is you don't expect it in a language that lacks embedding or lacks recursion. And that's a matter of inference, therefore, rather than syntax. So there's no sequence of tense markers in Pitaha. If you don't know what those are, it's probably not worth the time right now to do the parenthesis, but I can send you a copy of the paper on Pitaha tense if you would like one. And since sequence of tenses require embedding, there are no sequence of tense markers in Pitaha. Just in case you wanted to hear Pitaha from a native speaker, that's what it's like. I always enjoy hearing languages. So now we move on. We've got all these signs and we know what propositions are and they don't have to be linguistic. How do we get meaning out of the whole thing? So if I said John saw Mary, how do I know what the contributions of Mary and C and John are to that sentence? Well, The standard view in formal linguistics is given by Szabo here in his 2000 book on compositionality. Principle of compositionality. The meaning of a complex expression is determined by meanings of its constituents and by its structure. I think that's pretty entirely wrong, actually. I think compositionality is an epiphenomenon. It's not central to language, and there's nothing special about it. Very often people point to compositionality as one of the core facts about human language, but I really don't think language has any core facts. I think that language is an advanced semiotic system, and all the core facts exist in semiotics. There are a number of semioticians who argue for compositionality in semiotics. I don't want to draw too fine a distinction or create false controversies. But this is something that I'm working on, and I don't believe that compositionality is crucial. There's another view of compositionality that comes from the work of Pietariinen. The meaning of a sentence is the meaning of all sentences that follow from that sentence, either by inductive or deductive, should have also said abductive principles and permissions under all authorized circumstances. So we infer things, and that's how we come by the meaning of things. This goes back, to the entire philosophical movement of inferentialism, and one of probably the biggest contemporary advocate of inferentialism is my former colleague from the University of Pittsburgh, Robert Brandom, whose books, beginning with the massive Making It Explicit, talk about our understanding of a concept, our grasp of a concept, our possession of a concept is non-existent until we can use it in inference. If we can't infer using a concept, then we don't have the concept. This has the consequence, one that's rejected vehemently by many psychologists, that no child can be born with a concept. You can't have a concept unless you can use it in inference. And since inference has to be learned, there's no way to be born with the results of inference. Peirce might have taken a more charitable view towards that because he did believe in instincts, and he would have probably accepted the possibility that there can be phylogenetically built-in inferential results. But in Brandom's view, and I think it's compatible with Peirce's view ultimately, unless you know how to use a particular word or concept in a discourse, in inference, and knowing what's false about it and what's true about it and what conditions it has to meet, then you can't be said to have the concept. And this is very different. So in this sense, the Piraha do not have a concept of number. In the paper that we published in 2008 in Cognitive Science, my co-authors insisted on arguing that the Pirahas had a concept of numbers, but they didn't use numbers. But I think that's wrong. If you can't use them, you don't have the concept. If you can't do inferences with them, you don't have the concept. So if that's correct, if Brandom's correct, I don't think there are any innate concepts. So Jerry Fodor, for example, would necessarily be wrong. Interpretation, here's my own view of how interpretation works, is the inference of meaning using one linguistic constituents, linguistic structure, cultural knowledge, contextual knowledge, and any other information we can get our cerebral cortex around. We use everything we can bring to bear on interpreting the world around us. Some of it's done very quickly, most of it's done unconsciously. No inference has to be conscious. We do a lot of conscious inferencing, but we also do a lot of unconscious inferencing. And we use cultural and real world knowledge in many of our interpretations of tense. So let's go from the exotic Piraha to the exotic English and go through a few examples. John reported that Mary has COVID-19. Yesterday, John reported that Mary has COVID-19. Okay, those are fine. Almost 100 years ago, scientists concluded that the ivory-billed woodpecker is pregnant, is happy, is flying. Barbara Partee gave me this example, and it's ungrammatical. So why is it ungrammatical? Or is it ungrammatical? No pregnancy lasts 100 years. Happiness probably doesn't last 100 years, and no creature is probably flying nonstop for 100 years. You might be able to say almost 100 years ago, scientists concluded that sharks are swimming. Maybe you could say that if sharks live to be over 100, but because they apparently have to swim all the time. But knowing that this sentence doesn't work is knowing that something about pregnancy and happiness and flying. So it's an inference from real world knowledge to the semantic interpretation. You could say almost 100 years ago, scientists concluded that the ivory-billed woodpecker is extinct. Now, here are the same tenses. I couldn't say is pregnant, but I can say is extinct. And the reason for that is extinct is something we know lasts forever. So that's fine. John claimed that Mary is pregnant. Yesterday, John claimed that Mary is pregnant. Those are both fine. 12 months ago, John reported that Mary has COVID-19. If she has long-term COVID, maybe you could still say it in the present tense. That's a question mark. 12 months ago, John reported that Mary is pregnant. Well, in direct speech, if I said 12 months ago, John said that Mary is pregnant, I'm not sure if that works, but let's, but in general, you can't have the present tense because pregnancy doesn't last for 12 months, unless you're an elephant. 12 months ago, John reported that the elephant is pregnant. That's fine because elephants can be pregnant that long. 36 months ago, John reported that the elephant is pregnant. That's not fine. That's wrong because elephants aren't pregnant for 36 months. 2 years ago, John reported that his neighbor Trisha is happy, but we know Trisha is not really that happy a person, so she's not happy very often. So that's, she can't be in the present tense. She couldn't have been happy all this time based on what we know about Trisha, but Mary's always happy. 2 years ago, John reported that his neighbor Mary is happy. Today, John reported that his neighbor Mary is happy. If we just say today, and I don't know anything about Mary, I don't know, I suppose that's fine. 2,000 years ago, John reported that the Virgin Mary is happy. Well, we can say that, okay, because the Virgin Mary is eternal, right? Therefore, she's always around and she's apparently always happy, except in the Pietà. She wasn't happy at that time. Zookeepers who examined Ellie the elephant in the Cincinnati Zoo 5 months ago announced that she is pregnant. That's, again, just fine because that's how elephants are. 1,000 years ago, John reported that Bill is his friend. No, that doesn't work. 1,000 years ago, John reported that Muhammad is God's prophet. That works because Muhammad still is God's prophet, although Bill is not still his friend because John and Bill are dead. 2,000 years ago, John reported that Jesus is alive. Well, that's supposed to work because Jesus is still alive. 2,000 years ago, John reported that Bill is alive. That's false because Bill is not alive. He's a human and they're dead. The ancient Egyptians believed that the earth is flat. You can use that, okay, because that's still the belief of the ancient Egyptians. So in all of these interpretations, the simplest explanation seems to be that we use real world knowledge to infer which sentence makes sense and which sentence doesn't make sense. If you want to defend a strict Szabo-like compositionality, you have to say that all of these features are built into the sentence lexically somehow. There are a number of reasons for rejecting that approach, but I don't have time here to really go into that. And it seems to be inference all the way down. John is 3 years old and is CEO of a major company. That could be true, but it's probably false because 3-year-olds don't make the best CEOs. John are the nicest guy I know. Well, you could say that's just strictly ungrammatical. It's a mismatch of features between the verb and the object, or the verb and the subject. But it's also something you can infer. Plural and singular don't go together. You can simply infer that fact. There doesn't need to be a more specialized syntactic operation, perhaps. Talking about Mary, he is a smart woman. Well, today, that might work. I don't know. It depends on what pronouns you've chosen for yourself. But we have to know what pronouns someone has chosen to be able to do these inferences. And strict grammatical. You can say that the pronouns have lost features and they can have male or female or mixed features, whatever. But it seems to be easier simply to say it's a general cognitive ability that humans have to infer using the real world situation. So 58 would have been clearly ungrammatical 100 years ago, but it wouldn't necessarily be ungrammatical today. Who do you wonder whether saw John? That's an inference. You're inferring that someone saw John, and you're inferring that you want to know, and you're inferring it very directly. It's pretty much a deduction that you're asking who saw John. 60 is supposed to be ungrammatical. Who do you wonder whether John saw? But we can infer the weirdness of 60 by realizing that John is the index of the sentence. John is the old information, because indexes have to be things we understand, therefore they have to be old information. When you're asking a question about information that is not shared. So who do you wonder whether John saw? That's supposed to be fine because it's governed. The trace of who is governed in the object position. But who do you wonder whether saw John? That is not supposed to be good because there's no ability to govern across whether from wonder to saw John. But you can also infer that you're asking a question about old information, which makes it awkward. Since the subject is old information. You can ask questions about old information, but you generally don't ask questions about old information. So take the example that Chomsky likes to use of the man is tall. You make a yes-no question out of the man is tall by moving the verb to the front of the sentence according to Chomsky's analysis. Is the man tall? So Chomsky says, or asks, does the child form the rule by the simplest available process, which is to move the first verb to the beginning of the clause? And that works for is the man tall, but it doesn't work for a sentence like the man who is tall is in the room. We do not ask, is the man who tall is in the room? We don't move the first verb to the left. We move the second verb to the left. Is the man who is tall in the room? Why do we do that? Chomsky says children must be born with an innate knowledge of subordinate versus main clauses, but that doesn't follow at all. There's a couple of things that are left out. First, who is tall express old information, and you don't ask questions. I mean, there's no particular need to ask questions about old information. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to ask about the embedded relative clause, whose whole purpose is to give clarity to the sentence. Also, we know that new information is marked in the icon part of the proposition, the predicate, and it's marked in most languages by intonational differences. In English, for example, by higher intonation on the object, which is part of the predicate. So the child has access to intonation, to old versus new information, and to gestures. So there's plenty of evidence for the child to decide that they should ask about new information and the verb. And so they move the verb that marks the new information to the beginning of the clause for a yes-no question. There's plenty of evidence for them to reach this conclusion through inference. It's not a learning problem. It's not any evidence for anything being innate, nor is it an evidence for even main versus subordinate clauses, because as I've shown in Peter Ha, we get a lot of interpretations between main and subordinate clauses that look like embedding but aren't, or two clauses next to each other. We get interpretations that look like main versus subordinate, but they're not. In fact, we get the same things in English, and Ted Gibson and I published a paper a few years ago in the journal Language, in which we gave a number of experimental results in which we showed that English speakers get the same interpretations in unembedded and embedded sentences. And we speculated as to the functional role of embedding. My own view is it's a way of compressing information rate, making information rate faster. But anyway, there doesn't seem to be any need to deprive ourselves of the tool of inference in language as a semiotic system, just as we use inference to connect any two signs. we can use inference in sentences. In fact, we can interpret sentences without them. So I just briefly, in the last 10 minutes, will go into something about language evolution. But let me just say first that this is also part of language evolution. So this is a sort of transition. Chomsky, arguably his greatest contribution to the theory of cognition and the theory of linguistics is something he did back in the 50s, which he did with mathematician Schützengroup. Anyway, it's the Chomsky hierarchy of grammars. My proposal on types of languages doesn't interact with the Chomsky hierarchy of grammars. It's separate. So to me, there's three types of languages that have to do with compositional opacity. So G1 is a linear word order that doesn't really have phrase structure. And that's compositionally opaque because it's the structures don't give us many clues to the meaning. We have to get it largely by contextual and lexical inference. G2 languages have hierarchical structures, but no recursion. So they're a step towards compositional opacity, but they don't quite get us there. And G3 languages have recursion and have still some compositional opacity, quite a bit, in fact, but they have less than the other two languages. So if I were giving examples, a G1 language would be something like John came into the room, a total flat structure, or John sat, or John slept. A G2 language would be something that has embedded structures, but not recursively embedded. So we have a noun phrase within a sentence, and we have this prepositional phrase shouldn't be there because it indicates recursion. But if we just had John entered the room, we have a G2 language. When we add John entered the room by the garden, then we start to get a G3 language. Jeff Pullum has a fairly recent paper in 2020 in which he argues that there are many languages without recursion: Walbidi, Wargamai, Hishkariana, Karaldid, Gavillon, and Amil. So he goes down a whole list of languages in which it has been claimed, but not noticed by the linguistic community at large, that they lack recursion pretty much the same way that Peter Ha lacks recursion. It's interesting that Peter Ha has drawn so much ire from other syntacticians, but when there's so many other languages in the literature, Jeff's point in his paper was that these languages are no problem for model theoretic syntax, but they're difficult for other models of formal syntax. And finally, G3 languages, most Indo-European languages, are G3 languages. But notice that in G3 languages, which have minimized compositional opacity, all the languages that have this can express their same forms by G1 or G2. So it's not that these are mathematically distinct expressive powers. These are simply reflections of greater or lesser compositional opacity. So if we're talking about language evolution, this becomes quite important. What's the first kind of language? I don't believe in proto-language. I think that was a dead end. I think that was a wrong way to go. I don't think that the late Derek Bickerton was right about any of that stuff. But when we talk about evidence available to tell the story about language, we've got archaeology, linguistics and field research, semiotics, comparative biology, philosophy, cog-sci, neuroscience, evolutionary theory, genetics, and so on. And I hope you were all as happy as I was to see that Svante Pääbo won the Nobel Prize this year. Such a tremendous accomplishment, something that has helped every one of us who's interested in the evolution of our species. So what is language? This is controversial. Language is a set of sentences described by a recursive grammar, or language is the transfer of information by symbols. So if you use indexes and icons only, and there's nothing symbolic involved, that's not quite language, but it is communication. But a set of sentences described by recursive grammar, that's saying that language is only G3 languages, which I think is false. Therefore, I reject the first definition and I accept the second definition. Language is the transfer of information by symbols. All entities in the world, arguably even minerals, if you're Peirce, communicate. Only humans appear to have language. So communication is the transfer of information by signs. Symbols are special types of signs. Language is the transfer of information by symbols. Therefore, I would argue and do argue in my forthcoming book that bees don't have symbols. And so I talk about some of the experiments that have purported to show that they do. I'm not a priori opposed to the idea that animals have symbols. I think it's ridiculous to say what animals cannot do without careful study. My dog knows a lot of symbols, and my dog uses a lot of inference. I think animals can definitely infer. So they're right there at the cusp of language, and some of the behaviors of animals get very close to language, but they don't quite get there because their symbols, to the degree that they have them, are not productive. So if I were going to revise that right now, I would say language is the transfer of information by productive symbols. And so I talk about this in my book, How Language Began. No mutations are necessary, no sudden appearance, just plain old natural selection. That's how language came about. And if we were telling the story, to me, language begins 1.8 million years ago. Not semiotics. Semiotics has always been with us. You can't have a universe without semiotics. You can't have any thinking without semiotics. So semiotics is the language of thought that existed. Peirce talked about that over 100 years ago, and he wasn't the only one. We can go back to the Stoic philosophers to talk about inferences from signs. But anyway, our hero in this part of the story is Homo erectus. This is one of my favorite drawings or sculptures of Homo erectus. Homo erectus was the most successful species in the history of the genus Homo. Our species has been around for about 300,000 years on the outside. Homo erectus was around for almost 2 million years. So, and in fact, you could say that Homo erectus is still here today because we used to be Homo erectus. If we could do genetic tests that would take us back 2 million years, we would all find that our ancestors are Homo erectus. Their average height, I should have put this in centimeters, was 5'8" to 5'11", which would be about 176 centimeters to 180, is around there. They had 950 cc brains on average, which overlaps in range with some European sapiens females. So it clearly can't be the borderline of intelligence. They were a wide-ranging polymorphic species, arguably possessed the modern vocal apparatus. But if not, it's no big deal. The human body evolves to support new abilities. In fact, some archaeologists, paleoanthropologists have argued that Erectus shows very rapid evolution of the vocal apparatus, and this fits with the idea that they came up with language, because modern vocal apparatus, human speech, the better it is, the more effective our communication. But remember that you only need one symbol to be able to have a language. You could have a language with just the vowel ah. It would be hard to remember the different links of the words. So if you have two symbols, let's call them 1 and 0, you can express anything that can be expressed. That's what computers do. After all, everything they do is done in terms of 1 and 0. So you don't need that many symbols to have a language. Homo erectus was an ocean traveler. The sea was never a boundary for them. They were tool makers. They had communities. They built community structures. They had fire. They had culture. There's nothing about them from a inferential point of view that would lead us to suppose they didn't have language. I'll skip this slide. So Homo erectus, their brain size is shown here in this circle in the middle. We find that Homo sapiens sapiens has the largest brain size on average, but we also find some Homo sapiens inside where we find erectus. The largest brain of human species was, of course, Neanderthal. Homo sapiens have brain ranges from 950 cc's for some females to 1,300 cc's for some males, whereas Homo neanderthalensis had brains of about 1,450 cc's. But if we were to take another two species, so for example, take chimpanzees, chimpanzees have a brain of about 250 cc's, whereas Australopithecus africanus had a brain of almost a similar size, but there's no question who was the most intelligent. So I'm not going to be able to go through all of this, but I've sent the slides along, and there's interesting reference to the laboratory of my favorite neurolinguist, Evelina Fedorenko at MIT, who's done wonderful work on localizing without having an innatist view of the brain. She does localize language in the brain across languages. So my conclusion is there's really no language organ. That's just that's largely a hand waving, and there's no disease of the brain or language, especially not specific language impairment, that is specific to language. I don't have time to go into that, but I could if you ask questions. Human ancestry, so Erectus is like the mother and father of us all, except we're not quite sure about Floresiensis on the island of Flores. So universal grammar, and I'll conclude with this. There are two types of universal grammar that have been proposed since the 13th century. From the Modistae, the first universal grammar provides us with the logical properties of meaning making. It's neither nature nor nurture, just logical constraints that language has to fit. This is Peirce's view, and he developed it initially under the term universal grammar, which he used for the first time in the United States in 1865, but he then changed to using speculative grammar, which comes from the work of Duns Scotus. The second universal grammar is, as far as I can tell, the major argument for it is my granddaughter is not a kitten nor a rock. That's Chomsky's usual response. No one denies that language is based on biology. That is not the question. The question is whether the biology is specific to language. The second universal grammar says it is. I would say it is not. Both universal grammars have recursion. You cannot have a language, a semiotic system, without recursion in Peirce's sense, but it's semiotic recursion. Semiosis is necessarily recursive. We interpret one sign, always interpret in terms of another. Whereas Chomsky's concept of recursion is syntactic, but that doesn't really seem to be necessary from the languages that I've looked at and that Jeff Pullum has looked at and other people have looked at. And the crucial question is whether language is mainly about form or meaning or about the combination in signs. And with that, I believe that I will stop sharing my screen and see if you have questions.
Thank you very much. Very well timed, exactly 60 minutes as we asked you. And we have plenty of time for discussion. So I open the floor for questions. The usual procedure, people on Zoom, please raise your digital hands and a queue will form automatically. People in the room do that physically, and I'll try to remember. But before I stop recording, as we agreed at the beginning, right, so that people can be more spontaneous in their questions. Let me thank you once again. And I remembered, I never replied to your question when I said tongue-in-cheek at the beginning that cognitive semiotics is the combination of what is best in linguistics, semiotics, and cognitive science. And you asked, was that intentional or extensional? That is it the best ideas or the best people? I'll say, well, both. So welcome to cognitive semiotics. So that's stop now. And right, please, Todd already has his hands up, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. It was very informative and agree with all your basic points. So one question that occurs to me in the discussion of Pinaha, I just want some more information. So for instance, Pinaha, you say much of their talk is about the here and now. And I think that makes sense. I'm wondering just to what extent or what is the proportion of Pinaha native speakers who are, say, bilingual